Deep in a forest in the heart of Europe lie the remains of a bizarre Nazi experiment. A plan so strange that only now can the full story be told.
They had this huge ambition to time travel back and try and recreate something which has not been in existence for 9,000 years.
Scientists from the SS planned to recreate prehistoric animals that had vanished from the earth. Beasts they believed a new Nazi super race would hunt in ancient forests across Europe. They had a master plan, and they were prepared to kill to make it happen.
It was a struggle for life and death, the beginning of a process which Hitler and other Nazis then called the final solution.
This is the true and astonishing story of how the Nazis tried to take control of nature and change the course of evolution.
Our orders are to clear the forest of all inhabitants, execute all undesirables.
In July 1941, the infamous Order Police Battalion 322 began hunting down and deporting thousands of people from the newly captured forest of Białowieża in a remote part of eastern Poland. Anyone who resisted was to be shot. 322 Battalion's atrocities in the forest were meticulously recorded in their war diary, which survives today.
The war diary of this Battalion 322 of the Order Police is a really remarkable document. It is horribly candid about the poor luckless villagers in the Białowieża forest. They are either being systematically deported, forcibly removed from their homes and transported to an uncertain fate, or they are being cold-bloodedly murdered and buried in mass graves.
Illustrated with its own photographs, the war diary records that in the 7 days between July the 25th and August the 1st, 1941, the battalion burnt down 34 villages and expelled over 7,000 people. On July the 25th, the battalion visited the forest village of Budja. The memory of what happened that day still lives on.
This photo is taken in July 1941 when they were burning the houses. This is what you see. It's a flat, completely flat, like in the picture, and it's a very, very big opening. 183 families, almost 1,000 people were deported. Few persons were shot because they were too slowly moving away.
The thorough and brutal clearing of this faraway forest was no ordinary operation. It was part of a Nazi project, which is only now coming to light. One vital source of evidence is in the war diary itself.
The population of the primeval forest of Białowieża is to be deported. This forest is to be a nature reserve for Reich Marshal Hermann Goering.
Hermann Goering was one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. He is Hitler's deputy and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. As Germany's master of the hunt, he knew Białowieża well. He'd shot game in the forest before the war as a guest of the Polish government. But for German leaders like Goering, this forest had a significance that went to the very heart of Nazi ideology.
Within only days of the invasion of the Soviet Union, Goering is making sure that he has seized this forest as his own to be protected. There's no doubt in my mind that before the invasion of the Soviet Union, he had earmarked this as an area that he wanted to secure for his own purposes.
Situated in eastern Poland, Białowieża was to be incorporated into the new German Reich. To the Nazis, this forest was nearly sacred. It was Urwald, primeval forest, an ancient wilderness stretching over 1,500 square kilometers. Bialowice was the last refuge of Europe's rarest game animals. It sheltered packs of wolves, the elusive Eurasian lynx, the European moose, and some of the last surviving European bison, the powerful animal revered by the Germans as the Wisent. These were animals that the Nazis believed their Aryan ancestors had hunted thousands of years ago in the forests where they had forged their racial identity.
I think the lure of the wild has been stronger in Germany than anywhere else. You can see that back in Roman times when the Roman historian Tacitus spoke of the Germans as the people of the forest, the purest race in Europe, who hadn't mixed with anybody else. Tacitus writes of the Germans, and they appear as a distinct, unmixed race, like no one but themselves. All have fierce blue eyes, copper-colored hair, and huge frames.
The great forests of Germania, celebrated by Tacitus, had been enshrined in German history for hundreds of years. It was central to the upbringing of young Germans, alongside the tales of Siegfried, the great warrior slayer of wild beasts.
The identification of the German people as a group who came from the forest, who derived from the forest, whose mental and physical qualities appeared connected with their life as forest dwellers, was absolutely central. This is a strand which fed into the Nazi vision of their future Third Reich.
After Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering was the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. He took full advantage of his position as National Master of Hunting, sparing no expense in promoting the activity in German culture and at international hunting exhibitions. This remarkable photograph, taken 2 years before the Second World War, shows Hermann Goering and a group of hunting officials gazing at a model of the Bialowice forest.
I think what's really extraordinary about this photograph is that we can see these men actually looking at a model of this forest some years before Poland was attacked and occupied. I think it's not over-imaginative to think of certain of the Nazis, and Goering comes to mind here particularly, as casting greedy eyes upon this forest and seeing it as the ideal place to realize their visions of a huge primeval forest which could be cleared of undesirable inhabitants and restocked with wild animals suitable for hunting.
The picture also shows another Nazi with the power to transform Goering's vision beyond his wildest dreams. He is Dr. Lutz Heck, zoologist and member of the SS. 5 years before the Nazis came to power, Lutz Heck and his brother Heinz had begun work on a wildly ambitious project. They planned to breed wild beasts that had not walked the earth for centuries. As zoologists, the Hecks had a strong pedigree. Seen here, either side of their father, Lutz Heck and his brother were directors of the great zoos of Berlin and Munich.
The Heck family became a kind of dynasty of zookeepers. So Ludwig Heck, the father of Lutz and Heinz, had been the director of the Berlin Zoo for years, and he was a prominent public figure in Germany.
Professor Dr. Lutz Heck is a very important person. His father was very big in terms of working with the research into bisons, and he and his brother decided to take this saving of animals to a new level.
The Heck brothers were entranced by the romantic myths they had read as children. Foremost among them was the mighty warrior Siegfried, who had tracked down and fought great beasts. Lutz Heck wrote,
In my youth, my imagination was caught above all by two huge wild oxen, which had become most legendary and are regarded as the most powerful representatives of primeval German game, the Wisent and the Aurochs.
A few Wisents, or European bison, survived in the forests of Bialowice. But the Aurochs, the fabled wild and ferocious ancestor of modern cattle, had been extinct for hundreds of years. Julius Caesar described them as
not much smaller than an elephant, extraordinary in size and strength, sparing neither man nor wild beast.
Now the Heks wanted to recreate these extinct animals and release them into the wild.
They imagined the aurochs as a wild animal, so a much more wild and independent, free-spirited beast than modern domestic cattle, which are, of course, notably placid and peaceful. They celebrated the notion that these aurochs would be both a larger, stronger, but a fiercer animal, living in the wild. And as far as the hunter was concerned, it represented almost an ultimate hunting challenge.
But what did they look like? Bioarchaeologists like Jackie Mulville have been excavating Auroch remains in their ancestral home, the Middle East.
These are two skulls from Bronze Age aurochs, which means they were around a couple of thousand years before Christ. We have the skulls of two, and we have the skeleton of the majority of this individual here. So you can see here laid out on the table some of the, sort of the giant ribs, the animal's jaw, its hips, and most interestingly perhaps, this is its scapula. So this is the shoulder blade of an aurochs. We can use the size of the aurochs' bones to work out how tall they actually stood. So from archaeological evidence, we think that males possibly 160 to 180, females probably about 150 centimetres high. So I mean, kind of my size, really. The males were probably only a little bit smaller than me when they would come sort of my eye line. So they're big animals, and that's just their shoulders. So their heads would be considerably higher.
The skulls and skeletons of the aurochs dwarf those of domesticated cattle.
This animal is a similar period, so it's Bronze Age, about 2,000 years before Christ. But what you can see quite easily is the size difference between these two animals. The skull of this animal is much smaller, it's also much narrower, and also the horns that you can see are much, much reduced. Instead of coming out and sweeping out to the side and pointing forwards like the aurochs do, the domestic cattle have a much smaller horn core.
For thousands of years, the aurochs had lived alongside their tamer cousins before they were finally driven to extinction. The Heks believed that domesticated cattle still retained the genetic key to recreating their larger ancestors.
The Heck brothers did believe that deep inside every domestic animal remained the beating heart of an aurochs.
Modern cattle, or modern farm animals, and modern humans for that matter, do contain many of the genes of their ancestors. That's what evolution is all about. We're all living fossils, that's us. And your average dairy cow is a living fossil of a much fiercer wild animal.
They had this huge ambition to time travel back and try and recreate something which has not been in existence for such a long time that it's incredibly difficult. They were trying to rewind back time. They were trying to go back about 9,000 years, which is when we first changed the aurochs into our domestic cattle.
The brothers researched ancient descriptions of the aurochs, their size, coloration, and horn shapes. They used cave paintings from the mountains of Spain as inspiration. They studied recently excavated skeletons, and they decided that all the key traits of the aurochs were distributed amongst their various descendants.
What my brother and I now had to do was to unite in a single animal all those characteristics of the wild aurochs that are now found spread between different breeds of tame cattle. We then bred these animals with one another to eliminate all the characteristics of domestic cattle.
The Heck's underlying idea was quite clear. They were going to recreate the huge size and violent characteristics of the aurochs by selective breeding from modern cows. In effect, they were breeding backwards.
Backbreeding, I guess, could be easily described as domestication in reverse. Rather than selecting for the traits that would make these animals more amenable, more productive, they were trying to select animals that they thought were more like this fantasy of an aurochs.
The Hecks now scoured Europe in search of different breeds with special traits. Lutz found wild bulls in the hills of Corsica, muscular cattle from the Camargue in southern France, and fighting bulls from Seville. Heinz added Hungarian breeds and rugged Highland cattle from Scotland.
He was looking for animals that would have a particular horn shape or a particular coloration and also a particular behavior. Especially for the wild behavior that Lutz Heck was looking for, he went to Spain to get Spanish fighting cattle in order to create what in his mind would be a properly wild animal.
The Hecks were applying the state-of-the-art genetics for their time. They believed they would need to breed many generations of animals before they created offspring with the right mix of characteristics.
There was a sense that heredity was a process in which individual independent elements were combined in certain ways. And this allowed them to imagine that they could be reassembled in a way into a whole new animal.
Their attempts to create a perfect new breed chimed with the ideology of the party that came to power in 1933. Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party began introducing laws that defined different levels of racial purity. They even used animal terms like crossbreed for children of mixed parentage. Technical terms very familiar to Lutz Heck.
Lutz Heck particularly appears to me to be somebody who was thoroughly steeped in this sense of the German people as a distinct ethnic group with these distinct physical and mental characteristics. He was clearly absolutely in harmony with the Nazi ideology.
For Lutz Heck, this shared ideology with the Nazi leadership presented a new opportunity. The aurochs breeding program was well underway, but backing from the Nazis would transform his project and his career.
Lutz Heck, right after the start of the Nazi party coming to power, became a so-called paying member of the SS, and he struck up a very friendly relations with Hermann Goering.
As Reich Master of the Hunt, Hitler's deputy, Goering, was the natural target for the role as major benefactor for the aurochs breeding project. The key to the National Huntmaster's heart lay with young super predators.
Komm, ja, mein Cäsar, kommst du mich besuchen? Mutti, kommst du mich besuchen, ja? Komm.
Heck kept Goering supplied with lion cubs.
Los, schön, spring, hopp. So ist gut.
When they grew too large, he collected them and brought them back to the zoo. Very soon, Heck and Goering went out hunting together.
Goering fashioned himself as a hunter and tried to relive this mythical version of the Germanic knight. And he was happily carrying spears to hunt in the forest.
Heck's wooing paid off. Goering supported breeding projects for a whole menagerie of forest creatures. Another extinct animal that the Heck brothers tried to recreate by backbreeding was the tarpan, the wild and aggressive ancestor of the modern horse. These two were designated as German beasts.
Dr. Lutz Heck vom Berliner Zoo, der Leiter der Fangexpedition.
With the Reich Marshal's generous funding, Lutz Heck began importing moose and bison from North America. Nazis like Heck and Goering believed that new blood from wild American breeds would add more vigor to degenerate Old World hunting stock.
People like Hermann Goering and Lutz Heck respect only a wild, aggressive animal. And while domestic animals are acceptable, in regards to the animals which are being hunted, animals which are hand-reared and fed are categorized as degenerate beasts. And this is unacceptable to the senior hunter of all hunters in Germany, Hermann Goering.
Wild, aggressive and independent animals were the goal of Lutz Heck's Aurochs project. When bulls and cows produced weak and feeble offspring, they were eliminated from the program. It was a trademark of the Nazis that they applied the same policy to human beings. The Berlin Olympics of 1936 was Hitler's showcase for the strong and the fit. The Nazi organizers went to great efforts to celebrate the German body beautiful, displaying the streamlined figures of the supposed Aryan victors in the struggle for life. Hitler's Olympics was for winners, but behind the display, the losers, those deemed the racially impure and the mentally ill, were not only prevented from breeding, they were being murdered.
I think there's an absolutely precise tie between Hitler's views of breeding from the best and killing off the worst, and the attempts to regenerate animals which supposedly were like those of a purer and more powerful past in their own history. Hitler wrote quite early in his career, in his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, with chilling foresight as to what was going to happen to humans. Whoever is not bodily and spiritually healthy and worthy shall not have the right to pass on his suffering in the body of his children. And when we look back at what he did, the terrible things he did, that's exactly precisely what was trying to be undertaken in the breeding program to get back to the perfect examples of cattle, of horses, and in the end of humans.
Hermann Goering was at the center of this Nazi ideology. He sponsored Lutz Heck's animal breeding program. He was also the man who signed the documents authorizing the final solution. In November 1937, he hosted a major international hunting exhibition in Berlin. This photograph, taken at the exhibition, shows Hermann Goering and Lutz Heck surveying a map of Białowieża forest in Poland, and in front of them is a gilded aurochs horn. Could it be that 2 years before the outbreak of war, Hermann Goering already planned to seize this Polish forest and turn it into the new Germania, a home for Lutz Heck's recreated animals? The Aurochs project had reached a critical stage. Although the animals looked like their fierce ancestors, they were still dependent on humans to feed them. They had to be capable of surviving in the wild, to be beasts worthy of Nazi huntsmen like Hermann Goering. So in the autumn of 1938, Heck loaded his beasts onto trains and transported them 780 kilometers from Berlin to Goering's hunting estate in the far eastern corner of Germany. Finally, after 14 years of this strange breeding experiment, the animals were released to see how they would fare in the wild. Lutz Heck was ecstatic.
The energy of our first wild cattle in the German forest and their innate beauty and strength aroused such enthusiasm that they were very soon left free to roam the moors of Rominter.
But other accounts from local people contradict Heck's claims about his animals' harmonious introduction into the forest. In reality, it was no longer safe to go down to the woods.
They're very violent and they're prone to attack passers-by. They even trash bicycles of the bicyclists that were there, according to reports. And especially what was problematic was that they disrupted the feeding of the deer. That was what concerned Goering and the hunters the most.
Soon after Heck's cattle began their rule of terror in Goering's hunting estate, the Germans launched their blitzkrieg on Poland. But due to Hitler's secret agreement with Stalin, the Soviet Union took possession of the eastern half of Poland. The primeval forest of Białowieża was still out of Goering's reach. For Lutz Heck, however, the war brought new opportunities. He was now free to loot animals from the zoos of the newly conquered countries to help his breeding programs. This is the only building in Warsaw Zoo to survive the war. In 1939, it was home to the director and his wife, Jan and Antonina Szabinski. Soon after the German occupation, Dr. Lutz Heck came knocking on the door.
Lutz Heck was a very important Nazi officer, and the visit was very official. Of course, this visit was probably very stressful to Szabinski and his family, and he came to give some important and official informations. The zoo will be liquidated, important animals, precious animals will be sent to German zoos. They steal important animals for all the zoos from Europe. The rest of the animals will be killed.
Antonina Szabinska later recorded her dismay that their favorite animals were to be plundered and liquidated. She and her husband may have failed to protect their animals from Lutz Heck's breeding programs, but they did save their Jewish friends from the brutal consequences of the Nazis' obsession with racial purity. When Lutz Heck paid his visit, he had no idea that Jewish families were hiding in the basement below.
I can't play piano, but Antonina Szabinski was a perfect pianist. And when she started to play something special, it was information to these people in the basement that here upstairs in the house is going something wrong, danger, and this was the signal: quiet, to hide, or to escape.
On June the 22nd, 1941, the Germans launched their invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin was caught by surprise. Within days, the Nazis had seized hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of Polish territory that had been occupied by the Russians. Finally, this included the forest of Białowieża.
I think we have to be mindful here of the absolutely vast spaces which the Germans did in fact take over in the summer and the autumn of 1941, and I think it's quite difficult if one hasn't travelled there to visualise these endless flat plains and forests and swamps, and an absolutely vast area. And this provided the perfect place in which to develop German colonisation.
The German military victories weren't simply going to mean a human conquest. Senior Nazi planners also prepared for a conquest by German nature. Foremost among these ideologues was Dr. Lutz Heck.
What Heck claimed was that the landscapes in the east had degraded due to the wrong type of inhabitants, and that by Germanizing the area, not just with German people, but also with German wildlife and German trees and German forests, that would restore the landscape to its original German state.
Although the forest of Białowieża was on the extreme eastern borders of Poland, 800 kilometers from Berlin, it was now annexed to German territory. This was the Nazis' opportunity to recreate the ancient forests of Germania, with Białowieża becoming part of a vast forest system stretching to the coast.
There was a big German plan to make a huge forest in northeast Poland. I mean, connect the Białowieża forest with Kneszyńska forest and Augustowska forest. Like make one big German so-called primeval forest here. And, you know, in German primeval forest was not place for any Poles or any Belarusians.
Goering's ambitions for the forest of Białowieża was supported by another of Hitler's henchmen, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust. He too had been a sponsor of Lutz Heck.
Himmler and the SS knew and understood and were in agreement with Goering's desire to see this area turned into a wildlife reserve and a huge sanctuary for animals, so they had no objection to that. They were, as I say, in sympathy with this, and they had no objection either to dispatching one of their units there early on to begin the process of ethnic cleansing in that region.
Within days of the German invasion, a unit of Himmler's execution squads, commanded by Goering's favorite huntsman, began clearing the forest of its inhabitants. Finally, Goering's plans were in place. A Polish forest was now to become a German Jurassic Park. But first, it had to be ethnically cleansed. In the next 3 years, they would expel over 20,000 local people. But as evidence from their war diaries show, they also committed some of the first massacres of the Holocaust.
The Białowieża forest is right at the sharp end of that process. It's one of the very first places where we see this happening. And we also see in the forest, perfectly modelled there, the various stages in the development of what Hitler and other Nazis then called the final solution.
These Jewish cemeteries are the only remains of Jewish communities that had lived in the forest since the 18th century. Within a few weeks, they were entirely eradicated, never to return.
The removal of the Jews would lead to this forest being regarded as one of the first territories to become Jew-free, or as the SS called it, Judenfrei.
The Jewish population of Białowieża were either executed in the forest or ultimately sent to extermination camps. Thousands of the non-Jewish inhabitants were also expelled.
The forest was going to be completely barren of human beings, completely wilderness. And the only human beings that would go in there would be German hunters. And this then goes back to the Julius Caesar's idea of bare-chested Germans with spears trying to run after an aurochs and killing it.
The Nazi obsession with the mythical origins of their Aryan ancestors was now being turned into a hellish reality.
Some would argue that the defining feature of Nazism is the centrality of myth in creating a national identity. And so in that sense, the scientific efforts to recreate the mythical landscape could be said to legitimate the violence in the East.
In Białowieża, tens of thousands of people were suffering from the consequences of these delusions. And in the midst of these deportations and executions, Dr. Lutz Heck came to visit the forest. Soon he had his animals transferred from Goering's hunting reserve, where they were raising havoc, and released them into their final destination, the ethnically cleansed forest of Białowieża. After nearly 15 years of breeding, this was his moment of glory. Seemingly oblivious to the slaughter around him, Heck recorded in his memoirs,
"It was a long and laborious process that ultimately produced this fine, healthy stock of aurochs. Every year now, the cows of the breed bring new calves into the world. Thus, the new breed flourishes and grows."
Heck began turning Białowieża into one vast wildlife laboratory. In this new Germania, he released bears, bred bison, and experimented with wild horses for his tarpan breeding program in Germany. As the breeding experiments continued, Hermann Goering replaced the police battalions with special units of Luftwaffe troops to continue the task of hunting down escaped Jews and fighting partisans. Once again, their diaries recorded their activities in precise detail. On the 30th of March 1943, Corporal Rudolf Trebus describes leading a hunting patrol in the western part of the forest. He spotted a group of partisans, including a woman, standing around a campfire at a distance of 60 meters. Trebus's patrol crept up closer before he split his force into two groups. He then led a charge, killing 5 partisans, including the woman. If the partisans happened to be Jews, they left them where they were.
They kill 139 Jews on wild hunting missions and individuals, and even taking the names of the individual Jews that they're slaughtering like animals and leaving their bodies in the ground so that they are a warning to few other Jews to not come in the forest.
The war diaries show that after a day of brutal killing in the forest, German troops were given free rations of beer for what were described as cozy get-togethers.
There is a lot of evidence that alcohol suppressed their unwillingness to kill people. It helps the group get through the process of killing because everybody's doing it and there's no exception.
When some of the men were later tried for war crimes, they explained that they were clearing the forest for a nature reserve and a hunting estate for Hermann Goering. As the war drew on, it became increasingly clear that the same forest that provided a sanctuary for wild animals provided good cover for partisans to fight a guerrilla war. In 3 years of fighting, the Germans never gained full control of the forest. Outside the forest, the tide of the war had turned. The Nazi map of Eastern Europe was rapidly unraveling as the Soviet armies forced the Germans to retreat towards Berlin. Most of the city was destroyed by bombing, including Heck's breeding facilities in Berlin Zoo. Although some zoo animals survived, the products of Lutz Heck's breeding programs, including his aurochs, disappeared without trace, possibly eaten by hungry Berliners and Russian soldiers. What happened to Heck's aurochs in Bialowice is still a mystery.
Afterwards, some of them are sad to have remained there and to have lived through all the war, all the fighting that had happened. Some of them are reported to still linger throughout Bialowice, at least for a few years, and after that nobody heard of them anymore.
Others believe that as Nazi creations, their fate was sealed.
I believe the aurochs were slaughtered by the partisans or by the Soviet officials. I do believe that just as the Germans believed that certain animals were Germanic, I do believe that the Soviets thought that they were not having Germanic ill-breeds running around in their forest.
In May 1945, Hermann Goering was captured by American forces in Bavaria. He later committed suicide during the Nuremberg war crimes trials. The entire truth of the massacres in Bialowice remained undiscovered until after his death. After the war, Lutz Heck was investigated for being a prominent Nazi official. He was subsequently exonerated as a mere follower rather than a war criminal. Both he and his brother continued their careers as zoologists. dying in the early 1980s. The primeval forest where Goering and Heck planned to create the new Germania still flourishes as a vast nature reserve, now shared between Poland and Belarus. Białowieża is still a major sanctuary for rare wildlife, including a large population of European bison. The descendants of the cattle that Lutz and his brother bred still thrive, and they do apparently bear some resemblance to the descriptions of the ancient aurochs.
You see here is a fine specimen of a hack cattle. You can see the yellow eel stripe running across its back. You can see the horns protruding outwards and then forwards, which was exactly what Lutz and Heinz were looking for. That's what they imagined the aurochs must have looked like. I can see the animals are quite fierce. This one looks very calm, but I'm a bit hesitant to go any closer to it.
Despite their physical similarity to their ancestors, scientists say they are no closer genetically than any other domestic cattle.
The truth is that the animals that the Heck brothers bred are probably not very similar to these animals in any way. They did their best to sort of, change the external packaging, but actually what's inside the box was probably not very similar.
To try and get your way through the maze of descent, which connects modern cattle with the ancient aurochs, is effectively impossible. You can fool yourself easily, and plenty of people have fooled themselves, by making an animal that looks a bit like what you imagine the ancient aurochs to be. But I can tell you one thing with complete confidence, it ain't an aurochs.
This breed are now referred to as Heck's cattle, to distinguish them from the original aurochs. To others, the fact that they remain products of a Nazi breeding program justifies calling them Hitler's cows.
When you're talking about the Heck cattle and the bison and these allegedly primitive breeds, they're strangely tainted for some people. But I'm not sure that these animals have got many political views. They're just cows. They're not higher or lower. They're cattle of a different kind. So let them be what they are.
These false aurochs were first bred into existence as a result of the same romantic myths and legends that inspired the awful Nazi obsession with racial purity. Both projects were failures.
If you look back at that really dismal period in human endeavors, when biology and politics became the same thing, and that's always a big, big mistake, that has really polluted both human genetics and animal breeding ever since. Now, that's no longer true. Human genetics is very much alive and well.
And animal genetics has moved on too. The remains of these ancient beasts are now providing the DNA which one day could enable scientists to clone a real aurochs. Once again, 7-foot bulls may indeed roam the forests. As Julius Caesar warned, sparing neither man nor wild beast.